Does that work better? Now it works? Okay. Wouldn't you like to have a mute button on some people? Just punch that button and you're done. Yeah, it's really nice to be here. I always enjoy coming back to the Valley. You'll find out in your lives when you invest in God's kingdom and you get away from people and you go back and see how God's working, it's one of the most rewarding things that can happen in your life. Like they said, my wife and I, we started together. I got a new pair of glasses. I'm still trying to figure them out. We started the Valley back in 1994 in the Hojo Inn. Never forget one of our first services, Jim Evans, who was there, passed on to heaven now, walked in and said, "You know who we are, we're just the Hojo witnesses." So whoever we were, we really didn't know, but God knew, and God began to work. And I think I'm going to go back to my old glasses. And God worked. So before that, I was a missionary with my wife. We were in Dominican Republic and Honduras, then the Valley. And now since we retired in 2012, I'm very involved with the mission work in Cuba. And I just finished my 45th trip to Cuba since I retired. God just really called us there. And so it's been a great experience. Not too long ago, I was coming back from Cuba, and I was sitting there on the plane, and the person next to me, and we started to talk a little bit, not much. And I said, well, I'm coming from Cuba. I was already up in the United States by then on the next flight. And he said, well, why do you go to Cuba? And I said, well, and he obviously didn't appear to, in the way he was speaking, that he was a follower of Christ. So I took the conservative way, and I said, well, we take down things to help. They're short on food and medicines. And I also visit churches, and we encourage pastors, and we do what we can to help. And he said, well, why do you go to Cuba when there's so many needs here in the United States? Why don't you just help here in the United States? And so I just had an answer to him. I said, well, I go to Cuba because it's a calling I had. That was the end of the conversation. He had no idea what a calling was, or what it meant to have a calling to something. I have lots of callings in my life. I have a calling to be faithful to my wife. I have a calling I had a calling to raise my children, and now to encourage my grandchildren. I have callings in the church we go to just down in Tennessee, just to be an encourager. I have a lot of calling. They're all part of my story. Or is it my story, or is it God's story for me? My wife and I are reading the book of Ecclesiastes. At our noon meal, I read a chapter of the Bible to Mary, and then we talk about it somewhat. Have you ever read straight through the book of Ecclesiastes? How many have read the book of Ecclesiastes all the way through? How many have never read that book? How many aren't honest? Because only a few went up and read it. I challenge you to read it, but you might want to read the last chapter, chapter 12, before the first 11 chapters. Chapter 12 tells you the end of the story. The first 11 chapters, that the writer, and they think it was King Solomon, who had 1,000 wives, who had all the money in the world he wanted. He goes through there and he says, you can basically, I'll give you a nutshell. You can make all the money and be very rich, but it's all meaningless because someday you're going to die and somebody else is going to have all your possessions. He says you can have all the knowledge, but it's meaningless because someday you're going to die and the knowledge won't do you any good. And he said you can become very famous. You can have a great position, but it's all meaningless because someday you're going to die and they're not even going to remember who you were. And he goes all these things about you can do all this stuff that looks so good in this world, but it's all meaningless because someday you're going to leave it all behind. And then he gets down to chapter 12 and he says, in about 2 verses, he said, the end of the story is this: fear God and keep his commandments. And I think what he's saying is, there's only one thing that is not meaningless, and that's to know Jesus Christ and do what he's called you to do in your life. Many things could have been my passion in life. There's a lot of things I enjoy. Back when I was in the first grade, I got into butterflies. And we hatched my first butterfly there in the class in first grade. And I made my first butterfly picture. And then as I was growing up, I collected butterflies. And then when we became missionaries in Honduras and Costa Rica went in language school, I started collecting butterflies again. And I still collect butterflies and make pictures. I like science. I like mathematics. I think I could have done okay in any of those subjects. It's things I like to do. I like baseball. And even though the Reds are going downhill, they're still better than they were last year, so look on the bright side. But you know, I thought, I'd like to be a baseball player, but God didn't give me any talent, so we can cross that off. I collected baseball cards. I had some from the 40s that people had given me, those ones that are smaller. I had rookie cards, I look back. I had Mickey Mantle and all those people, and when I went off to college, my mother threw them all away. I wish I had them, but you know, it's really meaningless. What does it really matter? I remember hearing a story, a fellow who was making really good in baseball back when I was probably 20, 30 years ago. And they were saying how his records will go down in history. And he said, 1 second after the first nuclear bomb, all those records will be meaningless. And think about it. There's a lot in life that's meaningless, that's important, that we enjoy, but it's meaningless. We live on a lake in Tennessee. I look out there and see boaters, and I can tell they're attached to their boats. You see fishermen day after day fishing, and it's all like their whole life is in there. And I thought, oh, that's fun, but in the end, it's going to be meaningless. In 1981, I took the Amtrak train from Ohio. Well, I got it up in northern Ohio, and went out into eastern Pennsylvania to give a missionary service. Normally, I went by plane or mostly drove to those services, but I took the train that time. I had my 5-year-old son with me. We went out, service went well. We were coming back on the train, and he went to sleep. It was in the middle of the night, and I was sitting there alone at the end of the row by the aisle, and in came a lady who was dressed very properly. I would guess she was in her 70s or 80s. You could tell she was someone educated by the way she acted. And she sat down there across the aisle from me. And we set up a little conversation. And she said, well, what do you do? I said, well, I'm a missionary in Honduras. And I began to tell her a little bit about my life. She said, well, I'm going to tell you about my story. She said, my husband, who had just passed away not too many years before, said my husband was a minister. He said he was very, very good. He was in a church in New York. And the way she talked, it must have been a well-known church, and I wish I'd asked her and written it down, but I didn't. Said when my husband was young and he felt called to be a pastor, said he worked some for a man who really liked him. Said this fellow had a business, and she named the business, and once again, I wish it be written down. Said it was a very large business. And she said he really liked my husband, but he had no children. And he told my husband, they weren't married yet, told him, he said, if you will give up this idea of being a pastor, I'll eventually make you owners of this business. And you can be like my son. You can inherit this business. It'll all be yours. She said, my husband told him, no, that's not what I'm called to do. I'm going to follow God's calling. So as time went on and the church was doing well, somehow he got involved with some lawyers in some cases, or they called him in to give testimony. Said these lawyers had a very strong law firm there in New York City. Said they told my husband, they said, why don't you give up pastoring and come help us in the law firm? You can help a lot of people. You'll make a lot of money, and we want you here. We'll even make you a partner, even though you're not a lawyer. She said, my husband said, no, that's not God's calling for me. Oh, that's nice, but that's not for me. She said, as the time went on, we began to take cruises. And on these cruises, my husband would give Bible studies. Said the people that owned the cruise line saw what a good job he did and how people were responding. Said they told him, why don't you you're getting close to retirement, you leave your church now and come and work for us on the cruise line. And you can give Bible studies on the cruise, and it'll be a great thing, and you'll make good money. Said no. My husband said no. that's not what God called me to do. I'll stay with my church. She said, Paul, I don't know if she called me a name, she said, don't stop doing what God's called you to do. Keep doing what God's called you to do. Don't let anything sidetrack. She basically said, we've had a good life. We're glad we did it. A calling from God is not meaningless. It's eternal. As a child, I'm giving you my story. It won't be your story. As a child, I grew up in a Christian home. I went to church. My mother, who just passed away at 104, would tell me she took us to church too often, and it became a negative experience sometimes. When we're saying too often, we're talking Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and sometimes for a revival every single night. Didn't matter if there was school or not. I don't think coming to church one time a week at the Valley is too often, by the way. In fact, you ought to be in a group besides. But some of the preaching I heard was very positive, some was negative, most I can't remember at all. But I do remember some of the songs. And the songs that really spoke to me are like, So Send I You to Labor for the Master, or Rescue the Perishing, Care for the Dying, Jesus is Merciful, Jesus Will Save, or songs about bringing in the sheaves. How many of you know that old song? And we will come rejoicing, and all these songs about missions. I remember those songs. I remember the Bible verses, but I especially remember the Bible verses where Jesus said, my fields, the fields are white unto the harvest, but where are the people? The harvest is great, but the laborers are few. Where he says, his last words where he says, go into all the world and preach the gospel. Those just really, really left an impression on me. It's interesting how that some songs affect some people and some verses affect other people. Here's a passage that just really had an impact on me. How can they call on the one they have not believed? And how can they believe in the one on whom they have not heard? And how they can hear without somebody preaching to them? And how can someone preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. And in Isaiah where it says, who will go? And Isaiah says, here am I, send me. And even as a child, those verses spoke to me. And even as a child, especially in junior high, I began to feel, and I can't explain how God calls us, but God began to say, I'm calling you to be a missionary. And I would get excited. I thought to go exploring would be wonderful. I thought that would be great. God still speaks to me through songs. God still speaks to you. Here's the words of a song we used to sing when I was pastoring here. So that's been, about 14, 15 years ago we sang this song. It's a song that really speaks to my wife. Speaks to me too, but this song really speaks to her. And here's what it says. And I'll just read you one verse of it. Let me not be blind with privilege. Give me eyes to see the pain. Let the blessings you've poured out on me not be spent on me in vain. Let this life be used for change. And we'll sit there and we'll think we've been blessed. And she'll say, but let it not just be in vain. Help me to see the people around me that need Jesus, that need help. And then it goes on to say, I will go, I will go, I will go, Lord, send me. I hope we all go say that. It's not all just to be a missionary or pastor. All around us, there's people that need Jesus. Like we just sang, I speak Jesus. I speak Jesus in my work. I speak Jesus in my school. I speak Jesus by my actions more than my words. I speak Jesus to the world, to the lost, to the poor and hungry. Take everything I am. I'm clay within your hands. I will go, send me. And then a song that really speaks to me. This is a song that after we were missionaries for a while, and I hadn't started to pastor yet here in Piqua, but this is a song that came out, and it really speaks to me. It says this, there is peace and contentment in my Father's house today, lots of food on his table, and no one is turned away. There is singing and laughter as the hours pass by. but a hush calms the singing as the Father, with a capital F, God, sadly cries, "My house is full, but my field is empty. Who will go and work for me today? It seems my children want to stay around my table, but no one wants to work in my fields. No one wants to work in my fields. Push away from the table. Look out through the window pane. Just beyond the house of plenty lies a field of golden grain, and it's ripe unto harvest, but the reapers, where are they? In the house, O can't the children hear the Father sadly say, my house is full, but my fields are empty." Those kind of songs spoke to me in a very special way. Different songs speak to different people in a different way. Different verses speak to people in a different way. But God calls us. Now, a lot of people feel called to do things for the Lord. Some things for preaching, some things that, if everybody became a pastor, who would be out there to preach to? Might as well preach to the trees. And sometimes I preach to people who are like a tree. This congregation responds. We can't all do that, but God has a calling for each one of us. God calls you and calls on me. But here's what I learned about my calling. It's not the talking about it that matters. If you feel called to do something by God, just do it. Go do it if God calls you. Maybe sometimes if you have small children, maybe somebody will say, someday I'm going to be a preacher like Pastor Andy or Pastor Mark. If your child comes like that, I remember I felt that way. My mother was very wise when I said I wanted to be a missionary. I think she knew that as children, we often say a lot of things. How many boys, maybe girls too, say sometime I'm going to be a train engineer. Someday I'm going to be a pilot. I remember when I was in college, everybody wanted to go into oceanography. There must be 10 jobs in that in the world. But everybody wanted to study the ocean. Different things like that. My mother was very wise. When I said I wanted to be a missionary, she neither over-encouraged me, but she never told me I couldn't do it. I watched our children when they were young. They had a lot of different things they were going to do. As long as it was something okay. As long as it wasn't something and they never brought up something I'd have to say no to. I say, well, you can do that. If God wants you to do it, you can do that. But I never got encouraged too much because they changed their mind many times. But eventually, they did what God called them to do. And I believe that's what happens. Don't over-encourage your kids. Don't under-encourage them. Just tell them this. I believe you'll do God's plans for your life. God has a good plan for your life. Do what God wants you to do. I told Mary when I was going to preach this song, my wife, I said, maybe I'll just get up and read one verse and sit down because this is my story. And here it is in Proverbs. Help me out, Rick. All right. This is my story. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. Not my way, but God's way. Complete trust for God to lead me. In all your ways submit to Him. Let Him do the path, and He will make your path straight. The old version says, and He will direct your path. This is what the Hebrew really says. And here's what it says. It says that He'll go before you and straighten it out. In the olden days, in the days of the Old Testament, when the king went out, the paths were dirt. They were often, probably the brush had grown up. And if the king was going through, if somebody really was important going through, they would go out and maybe for weeks ahead of time fix the path. They'd fill in the low places, get the rocks out of the way, cut off the brush, so when the king went through, it was all ready. And that's the picture I'd like to have with my God. When I go down this path, it's not me, it's not my path He's directing. He's farther out. He's preparing the way. My job is to walk in the path that God prepares for me. And that is my story. That's what I've tried to do. Because as it says in Jeremiah 29:11, He says, for my plans, I know the plans I have for you. Plans, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and future. I really believe that. I think God has a good plan for all of us. And maybe you've messed up. Maybe you've completely blown it up till now. God says. In fact, he wrote this to the children of Israel when they had messed up. God still has a good plan for your life. And that can be your story. In the book of Matthew, we read a story about when Jesus was going to go to the cross. And he took time, and Jesus went to his disciple. It says, from that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hand of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day rise to life. Now, this wasn't very pleasant to the disciples. They pictured Jesus as coming down and setting up an earthly kingdom. I mean, they saw all the power he had to heal the sick, raise the dead. They figured he can do everything. And then he's telling them, he says, God's plan for me is to go to the cross and die and be crucified. And they did not like that plan. And so Peter speaks up, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him and says, never, Lord, he said. That's not going to happen. In other words, Peter is saying, Jesus, you say this is God's plan for you. This is your story. But I'm telling you that humanly that doesn't make sense, and I don't like it. So Jesus turns to him, and he says to Peter, get behind me, Satan. Now, that's pretty strong. You know, I would tremble. How would you feel if you made a bad choice or gave some advice, and Jesus all of a sudden popped up in front of you and said, get out of here, Satan? That must have really taken Peter back. What's he saying? He's saying you're speaking for Satan. What Satan wants is for Jesus to not follow through with God's plans for his life. What Satan wanted was for him to bow down and take the shortcut and not do what God had planned. And what Satan wants to do in my life and your life is that we rationalize away the plan really has for you. And we say, no, that's not so good. I couldn't serve there. He expects me to give a tithe. How are we going to do that? He expects me to give money for God's kingdom. You know, I'd rather go out and go fishing today. That's better for me. And Satan wants to get us sidetracked. He said, you are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. And then Jesus took him aside, and he said to his disciple, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves. In other words, for me to do God's plan for my life and for my story to be his story, there's some things I couldn't do. I couldn't get involved. I actually majored in zoology in college. I couldn't devote my life to zoology, even though I love zoology. There's things I couldn't do. It wasn't choosing between something bad and something good. It was choosing between something good and something better. He said, must deny himself and take up their cross and follow me. Now, this part of the verse I never liked because it sounds painful. To take up a cross is painful. And I thought, why does he say we're to take a cross? I've preached now for 50 years since I took my first church, way back when. I never saw this verse with the same meaning as I did when I prepared this message. Interesting, I can study and preach the Bible for 50 years, and God's still teaching me things about his word. And it dawned on me, he's not talking about crosses. He's saying the cross is God's will for me, Jesus said. What he's saying is we must deny ourselves other things and take God's plan for our life and follow him. For then he says these next words, for whoever wants to save their life will lose it. In other words, if we go out and our project is to become wealthy just for the sake of wealth and not to use it for God's kingdom and to bless others, if we want knowledge just so people can say how smart we are, If we want to have a position just so we can show off and feel good, he says, eventually we will lose that. It's meaningless. But whoever loses their life and does it my way for me will find it. Will find it. As I look back in my life, I can see how God has given me blessings beyond measure. We went as missionaries. We have experiences that no one else can understand. The places we've gone, the things we've done, the little things he's given us in life. Go out to Honduras and discover there's a little island out there in the ocean 20 miles out, about a mile from another bigger island. We go out there and just rent the whole island for ourselves and go fishing and swimming and over the reef, and probably been out there 30 times, 40 times. A blessing that we never ever thought we would have. When we lost our life for Jesus, we not only found our life, we found so many blessings. Going to the jungle of Peru, I always wanted to go there. Now I've been there 5 or 6, 7 times on mission trips. I lost my life, and I really found it. When we started this church, it was exciting, but it wasn't like now where we've got a lot of things. You know, it was starting out. But now I come back here and see all of you, most of you who weren't here when I was pastoring, and I think, I found it. What a joy to be here. This is my story. This is my story. What is your story? Have you lost your life so you can find it? You know, when I think about Jesus, after the resurrection, have you ever seen a picture of the risen Lord where he wasn't smiling? It was painful, the cross, but he's so glad he did it. Some people think, well, Paul, you've had it so easy. You had Christian parents, everything went well. Oh, no, we've had our trials. We've had times when it was so tough, my wife actually was sick over it, and we had to get out of a certain situation because she was just plain getting sick. And we've had times when people opposed us. We had times we felt called that our calling was to bring people to Christ and see changed lives, and other people had other goals, and it was tough. We've had times when I was out as a missionary and our little daughter got so sick and Mary was alone and didn't know what to do, and took her into to the doctor, and she was just crying, she told me. And the pediatrician, a Honduran, a wonderful man, he said, oh, I'll loan you your credit card. She thought it was because we were out of money. She said, no, I just don't know what to do. We've had times like that, and so have you. But I tell you what, it was all worth it, because God has a good end to the story. This is my story. Well, we went out as missionaries. That was our goal. And then lo and behold, after 15 years of missionaries, we decided that God's calling us to come back to the United States and preach. I found out I love to preach. I didn't know that when I went out as a missionary very much. But I found out the more I preached, the last year and a half in Honduras, became the pastor of the main English church in all of Honduras. And I loved to preach. It was a great experience. And so I came back to preach and eventually start the church here. And some well-meaning people came to me and said, did you lose your calling? I thought God called you to be a missionary. And now you're not doing it. What's wrong? And it brings me to the second very important verse that speaks to me in the Bible. And here it is. Whether you turn, bring it up, Rick, whether you turn to the right or to the left, your ears will hear a voice behind you saying, this is the way, walk in it. You see, if God's going to go before me and prepare the path, it means I don't know where that path is going. If I'm just walking the path, I can look down and see it. But if I really believe that God goes before me and prepares the path, if you really believe that, you don't exactly know what's ahead. And this verse says, whether you turn to the right or to the left, you'll hear a voice saying, this is the way. And God began to speak to me and to Mary and say, your time here is over. It's time to go back to the United States. It's time to preach. It's time to put your kids into high school in the United States. And so we did it. And were we still doing God's will for us? 100%. Because if you're going to let him go before you and make the path, You don't know what that path will be. I never had the intention of being instrumental in starting this church, but God knew. And God has a plan for you, and He goes before you, and He directs your path. And I have too many pieces of paper up here. I'll find the next one. I was just in Canada all last week with our good friends that are the leader of the Nazarene Church of all of Cuba. They're Cubans, and they can get a visa to Canada, but not to the United States. So I've been up there all week with them and speaking Spanish. Last service, I reverted to Spanish all of a sudden in the service. That still happens. But anyway, I made lots of notes because I was going to be home to do it. You know, sometimes God nudges us that way. When God nudges you that way, do it. I went to the up to Kansas City, where the headquarters of the Nazarene Church is, and I met with the man who was in charge of all Nazarene missions, and he wanted to have an interview with me because we told him we weren't going to go back as missionaries. And he brought me aside, and he told me, he said, you know, if you would still like to feel like you should be a missionary, we've got a new calling for you. I found out later it was being in charge of all the churches in the Dominican Republic. And I said, no, I don't think so. He didn't tell me what it was. He was very wise. He didn't say, well, we really need you. He didn't say, are you losing your calling? He said, God bless you in your next step. And he went and wrote me out a letter of recommendation. Sometimes God calls somebody to something and you don't understand why. And you'll be sorry to see him go. Instead of saying, oh, we'll miss you, oh, why are you going, what are we going to do? Say, God's going to bless you and God's going to bless us too. And Pastor Andy, as he goes to be the district superintendent, he needs your encouragement. He needs your prayers more than ever. Keep praying for him. And Pastor Mark, as he comes to lead the church, God has a plan, because God's plans are perfect. Our job is to follow them. So, at first, I didn't want to preach, but God called me to preach. Pastor Mark, I listened to his sermon the other time. He tells how, remember he told you he got up to preach and he was scared to death the first time? And now, what a tremendous preacher. You see, God calls us to something. If we'll turn our lives over to him, at first it may seem impossible, but God will give you the strength and God will give you the encouragement, and you'll find out it was God's calling for you. I had to try preaching to find out I wanted to preach. In seminary, I figured out a way to avoid the class where you had to do it in public, because I had high enough grades, they let you pick your own courses. And that's one reason I wanted high grades, because I was scared to death to get up front. My first sermon when I took to church when I came out of seminary was 10 minutes. They loved it because the former preacher preached over an hour. But eventually I got comfortable and I found out I wanted to preach. Maybe God's calling you to something and you're afraid to do it. If someone asks you to help in the nursery and they think you're good at it, maybe you ought to try it. Maybe it is your calling. Or maybe they call you and they say, you know, you could lead a Bible study and you're scared to death. Give it one try. You might find out it's a calling. If God calls you to do, if someone encourages you to do something, try it. Maybe God's calling you to do that. God has a calling for you and a calling for him, from him. This is my story. I get excited when I preach. I'll feel better all day because I preached. Sometimes I wonder what I said. I'm scared to go back and listen to it because I don't even know. And I just hope it's okay. But you know, when you do what God calls you to do, it energizes you. You ever notice how when Donnie's up here, he gets excited? And he just energized. We were talking about that before service. And he's energized. But I see other people in the church that get energized. You know, Pat Jeffrey, some of you know her, some of you don't. She just turned 91. She served in the nursery for years and years and years. I couldn't talk to Pat, but what she'd get excited about the nursery. It was her passion. Barb Schwartz, some of you remember her. She's still around, but she's not here anymore, but she did preschoolers. The whole time I was pastoring almost. and all those years. And I talked to her, she'd get excited about preschoolers because it energized her. Bonnie Marks, I don't know if she's in the service or not, but Bonnie, if you're in here, I can't, if I talk to Bonnie, she wants to talk about children's ministry because it excites her. Different things excite different people. Mike Davis, some of you know him, some of you don't. He came, he was good. He had a job where he worked up on roofs some. And he found out that we needed somebody to go up on the roof and clean the gutters and different things. And Mike said, I can do that. And I talked to Mike, and he would tell me about the roof. He'd tell me everything that was up there because it motivated him. And then I needed somebody to wash windows. And one day I said, well, Mike, you want to wash some windows? He said, sure. He doesn't go up on the roof anymore, but he still washes windows. But you know, he's excited about it. Why? Because it's a calling. You see, most of you aren't going to be called to be pastors. Maybe somebody is. Most of you aren't going to be called to be missionaries. You can still go to Honduras once in a while. But even here in the church and in the community, God has a calling for you. Talk to Kathy Mays about going into the school and having Bible studies. And some of you ought to be involved, and you're afraid to do it. Give it a try. Maybe it'll be something you want to do. She's excited about it. I remember when we first started the church, we decided we were going to use volunteers to clean it. And everybody thought, you can't do that. It won't get done. It does get done, even in this big building. But we were just there in the first unit. And one day I was talking to Darlene Haynes. She'd been cleaning the bathrooms since we started, probably about a year in. And she came and she said, one of my friends was talking to me, and she said, why do you clean? Why do you go out there every week and clean those restrooms for Paul? She said, I looked at her and I said, I don't clean those restrooms for Paul. I clean them for God. And that's the secret. We're serving God. Because while this is my story I'm giving today, I like to think of it differently. It isn't my story. This is his story. My story can't be your story. Your story can't be my story. But all of our stories can be his story. One time, Jesus said these words, come to me, all you that are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. That's a very popular verse. Come to God in your problems. He'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon me and learn from me. That's not quite as popular. That's saying, let him, the yoke of the cow, in other words, to lead, and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart. That's a positive to most people. And you'll find rest for your souls. But the last part, quite frankly, isn't as popular. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And we say, how can it be easy and light when it forces us to do things we didn't plan to do? And we give money away like we never thought we would give it away. And we begin to live for the future and not just for meaningless things of the present. But what I have found in my life, when I do it his way, it is easy, it is light, because he goes before me. And it can be the same for all of us. I'm going to close with a story. It is about when I was missionary back in the late 1970s. First starting out as a missionary, we were in the Dominican Republic. My main assignment was to work with the Haitians that came over from Haiti to harvest the sugarcane and to do the sugarcane fields in Dominican Republic. They would come. The sugarcane company had set up towns. It was a big, big area. Probably, I would guess, it was 50 by 50 miles. It was a big area of all this sugarcane. And they would make little villages. And there might be 500 to 1,000 to 2,000 people in these little villages. They called them bates. And we were starting churches there. It was a very fertile field for the gospel. Churches, they just start spontaneously. If you've never been through the sugarcane fields on dirt roads, you're missing experience. You drive along. If the sugarcane hadn't been cut, it's so high, you're like you're in a tunnel, right, without a top. And then you come back the next day and it's been cut, and I could see 20 miles out to the mountains. It's easy to get lost. There's no map. The dirt roads just go from town to town and here to there. Once in a while, a gravel road. And I would go out there to visit the churches. I couldn't do it on my own. I would get lost. I couldn't find it. But there was a Haitian fellow that spoke some Spanish, and my Spanish wasn't very good then, but I could speak some Spanish, and he'd go with me. I'd preach in Spanish. He'd translate to Creole, Haitian Creole. We'd get along fine. But to get from one place to the other, his name was Rogelio Perez. All I had to do was have him with me. Because we'd go down there, and up would become a new road, and I'd say, should we turn? He said, no, just go straight. I did learn that I had to ask him in advance because he was used to walking. And we'd come up, I'd be going 30, 40 miles an hour down these dirt roads, and probably faster than I should have been. And we'd come up to an intersection, he'd say, oh, we need to turn here. And you just can't do that when you're driving. But some of you might try it, but you shouldn't. But he'd tell me to turn. And then we would go, and sometimes it seemed so far. And I said, Rogelio, how much farther is it? He always gave me the same answer in Haitian Creole. He said, it's un bon petit distance. What that means is it's a good little distance. And I go another 15 minutes, and I thought, surely we're there by now. I said, Rogelio, how much farther? Same answer, un bon petit distance. I mean, those first 15 minutes didn't matter at all. It was always the same answer, a good little distance. But you know, we'd always get there. He'd always tell me where to turn. We'd always make it. Sometimes it seemed longer than others. We'd always make it because he knew where we were going. I don't have a Rogelio Perez with me when I go now. I have a GPS. Do you go by with your GPS too? When I was up there in Canada, I was going places I'd never been. It took me down side roads, and that little lady would speak to me, and she'd say, in 1 mile, turn right, and half a mile, turn left. And, you know, we got where we were going. I had to go into Toronto to pick up my friends, and downtown, I've never been to Toronto area. We got right there. We went. All I had to do was listen to her. She gave me good advice, and we made it. But then sometimes I'm going down the road and need to get off and get some gasoline or something to eat. And you know what she says? She'll say, turn left here, turn right there, go here, and get back on the track. And eventually I'll get back on, and when I do, I get there because she knows where we're going. But then sometimes I get too far off the track. You ever do that? She'll say, turn around, make a U-turn. But she'll get you there. And God is like our GPS. He's directing you. And sometimes maybe you've been focused and you get a little bit off track, and God says, no, back over here is where I want you. I can't explain how God works through songs, through scriptures, through people. But when you seek his will, you're going to find it. And he puts you back on path again. Coming back from, I spent the night up in my daughter's house up in Perrysburg, Ohio, by Toledo. And yesterday I drove down, and I had all day to get down to Greenville. I stayed with my brother. And so I decided to take back roads. I just wanted to drive through the countries and relax. And so I start down, and that little lady says, turn right to get to Greenville. And when do we get back on I-75? And I just go straight. You know what she does? The very next street, she says, turn right. And I say, no, I go straight. And then she says, well, 2 miles down the road, turn right. And I don't do it. And eventually I turn right and I get here. Sometimes in our lives, we don't follow exactly what God's called us to do. But God in his mercy still directs us back. He said, this is the way. I still have a goal for you. There's still a future for your life. But then I was up in Owen Sound in northern Canada, and we decided to go get something to eat. We drove down. I looked, there was a Wendy's nearby. I said, let's go there. We'll get a hamburger. We'll get something to eat. So we did, and it was only like a mile away. And I thought, surely I can find my way back. And so I didn't put in my GPS. And do you know what happened? I got lost. And we began a discussion of where to turn. And finally, I pulled over to the side of the road. and turned back on my GPS, and she had in the address of the hotel, and sure enough, turn right, turn left, do this, and we got there. There's been times in most people's lives, even if they followed Christ, there's been a moment when they weren't quite as concentrated on what God wanted them to do. And begin to realize, I'm not in the right place. I'm not in the right ministry. I'm not handling my money right. I got some thoughts I need to clean up. And God comes and says, turn back on the GPS. Start listening to me again, because I still have a story for your life. I also learned with the GPS that once in a while I'll be going to a destination, and for some reason we decide we want to go to a different destination, but I don't tell the GPS. And so we start down, and pretty soon we're quite a ways away from the way she wanted us to go. And you know what she tells me? Recalculating. And she gives me a whole new way to get where I was going to go. For some of you, you've gotten away from God's plan for your life. The original plan God has for your life isn't going to work anymore. Too much time has passed. Too many decisions have been made. Maybe you walked out on somebody you shouldn't have. Maybe things have happened in your life that shouldn't have happened. Bitterness came in and shouldn't have been there. God still calls you back, and He says, come to me because I still have a good plan for your life. It's not the same plan, but it's still a good plan, and it will still get you where you ought to be. And then sometimes with my GPS, she'll come on there and say, there's been a crash down the road, and she'll give me new directions. The crash wasn't my fault. I didn't do it. But my route has to change. And some of you have had a crash in your life. Not a crash you did, somebody else. He walked out on you. She went the other way with somebody else. You were fired from your job unjustly. An illness came to you or somebody you love and set you back. Someone passed away that was so important in your life. And Satan says, it's over. And God says, there's a crash that way, but I still have a good plan for you this way. And whatever's going on in your life, whether you're here, listening online, whatever's going on, God has a good story still for the rest of your life. A lot of meaningless things we follow after. We need exercise. We need to have things we enjoy. But remember, the greatest part of the story is eternal. God calling you and me to something greater than we are. Let's pray. Lord, thank you that your story isn't over yet. That for each one of us in this stage of our life, whether young or old, whether years in your kingdom or brand new to you today, even for someone here today that has never invited you to their life, this can be the day, this can be the moment that they pray with me. Lord, today I give my life to you. I want your story to be my story. Or maybe better said, I want my story to be your story. Today I turn my life over to you. May we all say that, whether for the first time or for the time over we've said it. Lord, today I want to commit, recommit, continue to say, I want your way more than anything else. Thank you that as we serve you, you send so many blessings, so many unexpected things, so many joyful things into our life. But Lord, whether it's a hard time or an easy time, we serve you. So Lord, as we go from this place, may we follow you and all our ways commit our lives to you, knowing you'll direct and go ahead of us and prepare our path. so that whether we turn to the right or to the left, we'll hear a voice behind us saying, this is the way, walk in it. Bless this church with the transition that's coming up. Lord, guide it as you've guided it in the past. May it be a beacon of light in this community, in this area of the world for you, not just here, but throughout the world. And may each one of us do the same. Wherever we work, wherever we go, whatever we do, may we speak Jesus through our lives, through our words, through our actions, through our resources. Thank you, Lord, that you love us so much, that you died for us. In your name we pray. Amen.